All right, hello, and welcome back to Dale's study session on the case for substance dualism. This is going to be part 4, so this is going to be the final lecture in my series. And after this lecture, that'll conclude the show, and we'll have a debate with Andrew on some of the things that I've been discussing in this series for you guys whenever he's free. This is, as I said, is going to be the last lecture in my substance dualism series. And if you remember in last time in part 3, we looked at some of the main pro-substance dualist arguments. About 4 arguments that I think are really strong and that show that my minimal definition of substance dualism is true. We are not identical to a physical substance like the brain or central nervous system or body or something like that. And I basically showed why I think this proves that on the second issue of contention in the mind-body problem, we are an entirely different non-physical substance. But this time I want to be fair. I want to jump onto the other side of the coin and look at it from the skeptics case, because it's not, physicalists have their own arguments against the truth of substance dualism and trying to support their physicalist notion that we are just physical or material substances, and that's it. So I've condensed all of this down to 4 main types of arguments that we're going to look at. And then after that, we're going to look at 4 main physicalist alternatives or accounts as to how skeptics who are physicalists try to account for, well, what is the conscious subject then? If he's not a soul, if he's not, some non-physical substance, okay, how do you account for him then? So we're going to look at that, and basically we're going to refute these and find these lacking on the part of skeptics. So let's get straight into it. What's the first contra-soul or contra-substance dualist argument? This is one that one of our listeners, Darren, has brought up, and Andrew, I think, has also brought this up. And there's this mechanistic problem of interaction. Okay, I'm a soul. How does that interact? How does a spiritual substance or a non-physical substance interact with a body? I mean, there are several cases or examples that people like Darren have pointed to where, you damage the brain and that somehow affects an attribute or a property or a conscious state that's traditionally attributed to the soul proper. So how the objection here is, how can these seemingly these things that are so different possibly interact with each other? We understand how physical interaction takes place and physical causation and all of this comes about. That's sort of the objection here. How can physical and chemical objects interact with a spiritual substance that's so different? Now, unfortunately for the skeptics, this problem is not really an issue for more informed substance dualists today, because this sort of presupposes an outdated Victorian notion about the ghost in the machine and Cartesian dualist notions around the 1800s, where the soul is thought to be totally other, totally unaffected by the body or brain. But of course, for centuries, substance dualists have never said this. This is just a ridiculous straw man on the part of skeptics. We've always believed in interaction. I mean, you stick a pin in me physically, I feel pain. Medieval men understood this. Jesus understood this. People in the Bible understood this. They also understood the other way. If I choose to raise my arm, boom, physical stuff happens and I physically raise my arm. So this notion of substance dualism interactionism is quite old and totally destroys the skeptics' claim that they can't claim here that, the notion that there's this ghost in the machine. But let's deal with this fairly. The problem is, how would the interaction take place on a mechanistic level? So I want to address this. First of all, my first rebuttal. In the first place, the skeptical argument simply assumes that if we cannot know how, on a scientific or mechanistic level, how the soul causes and or body causes effects on the soul and vice versa, then this proves that the soul can't cause anything in the brain, body or brain. So the absence of any known mechanism is said to prove the absence of the soul. This is complete rubbish and illogical on the part of skeptics. It simply betrays their bias. There are multiple examples in science of where we know 100%, we know scientifically that one thing causes another without us having the foggiest notion today as to how that interaction takes place. And this is even the case with entities that are drastically different types of things. For example, a magnetic field can move a tack. That's a field, a totally different thing from a physical object made up of molecules and atoms, yet there are standing cause and effect relations. We don't exactly know, I can't describe perfectly how that takes place. Or gravity, that's a force, can act on a planet, a physical object, even when it's millions of miles away. How does that interaction take place? You don't know at any kind of in-depth level. We just know that it does. They do stand in these cause and effect relationships. Another example of protons. They exert repulsive forces on each other. Basically in all of these examples, we know with virtual scientific certainty that one thing causes or interacts with another thing, even though we have no idea how that interaction takes place. And this is the case even though the cause can be drastically different in nature from the effect itself. So another refutation here is, look, for physicalists, here's the how question about what mechanism allows the soul to interact with the brain is a complete misnomer, as I mentioned. Such questions really only apply when there is no need for an intervening or intermediate when there's a need for an intermediate mechanism between the cause and effect. So this is what we have in science, right? You can ask, well, how does my turning a key cause my car's engine to start? And you can, there's a series of intervening or intermediate mechanisms. Turning the key turns this thing, and that causes this to happen, and that causes this, and that causes the engine to warm up and rev up, or blah, blah, blah. But this is just question begging when it comes to how the soul interacts with the body or the brain, because that could very well be a simple or direct and immediate causal chain. I choose to raise my arm immediately. My brain produces the effect that allows me to physically raise my arm. So there is no need necessarily for intervening mechanisms to be described in the first place when it comes to how the soul interacts with the body and vice versa. So these are the two main objections to this interaction argument, if you could call it that. But actually there are a couple nuanced ways that skeptics can provide a different version to this argument. So basically, sometimes skeptics or physicalists will attach another type of argument here based on interaction between the soul and the brain. One of our listeners, Darren, has actually hinted at this in his own critique on my series. So what they'll do is they'll try to say the soul interacting with the body would entail the creation of new energy being injected into or interjected into the brain or body, right? This violates the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of mass and energy. No new energy can be created or destroyed in the universe. This is a scientific law that's firmly established. Skeptics will go, haha, got you. What do we say in regards to this skeptical version of the interactionist argument? So basically, there are three responses to this nonsensical claim of the skeptics. Number one, first of all, the first law of thermodynamics is not a metaphysical law or principle. I'm sorry, it's just a scientific law that describes the way nature normally operates within a closed system. And that's what rules out the creation of new energy in the universe. But it's just a mere heuristic scientific guiding principle employed for scientific purposes. There's no metaphysical necessity to this law, and therefore it's totally irrelevant. Next, as I said, as I hinted at, this law only applies to closed systems. It's not subject to outside influences, such as me as a prime mover having a soul and interjecting as an unmoved mover to make a choice to do something or not. So yeah, it's just absolute biased question begging on the part of skeptics to assume this closed system, that the brain is a closed system, in order to make this argument here. It's pure non-evidenced assumption on their part. No proof at all. The interjection of mental causality between the soul and the brain could even be so negligible that it's not actually detectable by modern scientific equipment. So yeah, basically it would be positively foolish on the part of skeptics to simply assume that the brain is a closed system where the first law of thermodynamics applies, and that also assuming that there is no actual energy inputs at all involved, simply because of their ignorance in us not being able to detect it. It could be so negligible that it's not detectable by modern scientific equipment. One thing I could point to here is think of quantum entanglement phenomena. Modern scientific evidence proves scientifically that these skeptics are out to lunch here, because we know for a fact that A can cause B without the need to create any new energy in the first place. These spin experiments, or these slit experiments and that sort of thing have been done to prove this. It's beyond all reasonable doubt. These two particles are causally influencing each other, but they're too far away to involve any exchange of energy, scientifically speaking. Well, it could very well be the same with substance dualism interactionism, or soul-brain interactions. I think the skeptic is just totally out to lunch in this objection, and he's been totally refuted. He doesn't have a leg to stand on when he makes these kinds of arguments. However, there is one last version or angle on this interaction problem argument. And that is, sometimes skeptics will say, well look, there's a breaking of the causal chain closure principle. So this refers to the skeptical notion that physicalism implies physical determinism in terms of causal chains. Remember, we discussed this in part 3. But a soul interacting with the brain or body would entail a prime mover or uncaused caused into the physical realm. And this causes skeptics to have great distress. But yeah, it's the same thing here. This is just pathetic. I'm sorry. Once again, physical causal chain closure is not a metaphysical principle or law. It's merely a scientific guideline of the way physical objects normally operate. There's zero empirical evidence that this general principle is inviolable on a metaphysical level, apart from skeptics simply making stuff up and making rules up to support their own worldviews. Also think of this causal chain closure involves ridiculous and obviously false notions, because mental states under this notion would at best be merely epiphenomenal. And that means they're like smoke to a fire. The smoke has no causal influence on the brain or body. But we all know from everyday experience, it's my being thirsty, my soul is what causes me to drink. It's not the other way around. So they obviously function. The epiphenomenal of the conscious states obviously functions in a cause and effect relationship. Epiphenomenalism is false. That's the interactionism problem. Now we go to the second contra-soul argument, number 2, and this is the one that most skeptics, including our listener Darren, who's sort of my interlocutor in the comments on this, they like to say neuroscience, the holy grail of this debate for them, proves the soul is unlikely. I think we showed how foolish that was in part 3 with the Benjamin Libet experiments, but Let's be fair and look at this. This is another this is the main argument, I would say, that modern skeptics will allude to, and they'll point to various scientific discoveries related to, oh, this brain state obtains, and this correlates to some kind of faculty that's traditionally attributed to the soul, or some kind of function, or that sort of thing, or a conscious state or property. And they honestly think that this proves that the brain states are identical to the faculties or mind, rather than just being correlated. By the way, I saw in the comments that there was an argument, well, scientists know the difference between correlation, even constant correlation, and causation. Great. Again, the claim here is that I'm happy to agree with you that brain states cause certain conscious states and vice versa, as a substance dualist interactionist. But that's different than proving they're identical. If there is a cause and effect relationship proven by science, that is the opposite and rules out the identity relationship from coming to pass. They cannot be identical. My conscious states and my consciousness cannot be identical to my brain states if they are caused by them. Otherwise, you get into the logical absurdity of self-causation. Yeah, as I said, same deal with the argument above. Typically, modern skeptics that appeal to neuroscience are totally ignorant of modern substance dualist interactionism, and this really more applies to ghost in the machine type views and that sort of thing. But essentially, there are two main fundamental refutations of this misguided notion of the skeptics. So number one, first, people don't actually postulate the existence of their mental states as a scientific explanation of their own behavior. Instead, we just simply know via introspection, a properly basic belief, what those states are. I kind of covered that in part 2, I believe, about that. But number 2, the explanatory evidence, which is undeniable. I mean, Darren's right to point to these experiments, and I don't deny any of the neuroscientific findings that have been confirmed. There is a dependency. The soul depends on the brain to produce mental phenomena. However, that doesn't mean they're identical, and that doesn't mean that they're dependent necessarily. The soul can exist without the body after death, for example. It just shows that while embodied, all of this evidence shows is that while we're embodied on Earth, there is a causal dependency from the brain on the soul and vice versa. And this is empirically equivalent to the substance dualist interactionist versus the physicalist notion. So it could be very well that, okay, there's only a correlation and causation relations that are obtaining, and this is what we're scientifically proving through neuroscience. But at the same time, there's no identity relations that are holding. The skeptic simply mindlessly assumes, oh, it's the identity relation, without any evidence to support that specific alternative over a substance dualist interactionist version, where causation or embodied dependency is obtaining, but there's no identity relation. So yeah, neuroscience can never, even in principle, prove an identity versus a correlation or causation relationship on its own merits. Scientific discoveries regarding the mind-body problem, they're helpful in answering questions about what factors in the brain and body generally hinder or cause certain mental states to obtain, but they're completely relevant on the question of the nature of those mental states themselves. Let me give an example to illustrate my point here. It's been scientifically discovered via neuroscience and neuroscientists that humans have what are called mirror neurons. When these mirror neurons are damaged, this hinders human beings' souls from feeling empathy for others, and or hinders human beings, right? And if substance dualism is true, that would mean it's this damage to my brain mirror neurons, my brain states, are hindering my soul from feeling empathy. But yeah, okay, so we have this basic datum. Mirror neurons are damaged. This hinders humans from feeling or expressing empathy. So what can be concluded based on this? Well, there are at least three empirically equivalent theories that is consistent with this data. Number one, strict physicalism could be true. The quale, that feeling of what it's like to be in that position, or the mental state property of empathy is identical to the firings of mirror neurons. Or B, mere property dualism might be true. A feeling of empathy is an irreducible conscious state, non-physical conscious state in the brain whose occurrence depends on these mirror neurons firing. Or C, substance dualism interactionism is true. Empathy is an irreducible conscious quale in the soul, whose obtaining depends, while embodied at least, on the firing of mirror neurons. All of these explanations are empirically equivalent. The skeptic has to prove that the other ones are improbable to establish that physicalism is true, and they simply can't do that based on the mere data that damaging mirror neurons prevents one from showing empathy. Sorry, that supports all three hypotheses, and the skeptics refuted here. He's been defeated in his claim. Okay, next, the third contra-soul argument. So this is another science-based argument. This isn't really a popular one that I think's that good, but it's it's inconsistent. Substance dualism is inconsistent with evolution. So they'll try to argue, well, humans are known to be merely the result of natural evolutionary processes. If this is the case, then physicalism is true. And if physicalism is true, then that means I am my brain, or I am a physical substance. The conscious subject is physical in nature. But this argument is just ridiculous on the part of skeptics. And again, it illustrates their sheer bias. I mean, first of all, intelligent design calls into question the truth of a purely natural evolutionary theory. That's evidence that needs to be reckoned with seriously by skeptics, rather than just mindlessly dismissed. And I find oftentimes that is how skeptics, at least lay skeptics, will operate. They'll just mindlessly dismiss intelligent design because CNN told them that that's a ridiculous, non-scientific argument. Sorry, if you want to prove your case, you've got to grapple with the evidence for intelligent design and refute that or defeat it in order to establish your argument here. Secondly, we've actually already provided strong evidence in part three that physicalism is false. So there are negative evidences against this skeptical argument here that we have. And again, they can't just be dismissed. They prove that physicalism is false. So I could make up my own argument if I wanted to. Well, if humans are known to be the result of naturally evolutionary processes, then physicalism is true. However, we have evidence from part three, physicalism is false. Therefore, human beings are not the result of natural evolutionary processes. Boom. I could easily make a modus tollens type argument based on that, as opposed to the modus ponens version that skeptics give here. Finally, C. Even if this argument is somewhat true, if we are the result of purely natural evolutionary processes, that doesn't entail that physicalism is true. Remember William Hasker, where he advances a form of emergent substance dualism, where the soul emerges after a process of purely natural evolutionary processes to get the brain to a certain level of complexity, at which point the soul, poof, it emerges on the scene as a new emergent substance. So yeah, this argument is complete rubbish and is refuted. Finally, we have our last argument, contra-soul argument, or Contra-Substance Dualism argument number 4. And this relates to Occam's Razor, the problem of simplicity. And those skeptics will say, look, Occam's Razor says that all else being equal, the simpler solution tends to be the correct one. So by simple, We just mean that it employs the least amount of unproven assumptions, or that it doesn't multiply entities beyond what is needed to explain something. So in this case, that entity being consciousness, the substance of consciousness, right? So yeah, basically this is a principle that's typically employed scientifically when two or more hypotheses are said to be empirically equivalent. Remember what I said before? So this is really employed as a tiebreaker. Remember that the argument from neuroscience, right? The mirror neurons. These are all empirically equivalent. So the skeptic could say, aha, but the substance dualist is positing an additional entity, a soul, a non-physical substance, where I'm just positing a brain, which we know exists. I'm just giving one where you're giving two entities to explain the same fact. Therefore, yes, they're empirically equivalent, but Occam's Razor says we prefer the strict physicalist understanding. So yeah, that, skeptics typically claim physicalism is simpler than dualism because it only employs this one type of entity, matter, as opposed to substance dualists who employ matter and mind or soul. So in response to this, there are basically two main problems in the skeptic's application of Occam's Razor here, in regards to the mind-body problem specifically. So in the first place, Occam's Razor is typically relevant only when a tiebreaker is needed, as we saw, as I mentioned. But actually, dualism is not the explanatory equivalent of physicalism. It's better than physicalism. Substance dualism has a far greater explanatory power and explanatory scope, and these factors override Occam's Razor, or the less ad hoc criterion for truth. Because physicalism can't explain free will, for example, something we all know we actually have, and you're lying if you say that we don't, that you don't know you have free will, based on your own properly basic beliefs grounded in your experiences every day. It doesn't explain the totalizing, unified view of the world that we have, that totalizing state. Doesn't explain the enduring self over time. It doesn't explain the modal arguments, proving that substance dualism is absolutely true conclusively. So yeah, the skeptics are really totally out to lunch here in employing the simplicity criterion, because I'm sorry, we don't have explanatorily equivalent options. Substance dualism completely destroys physicalism when all the evidence is factored in together. Secondly, remember I mentioned in part 2 that we have private access or private knowledge of my own internal conscious states. So the soul will directly and immediately interact with the body to cause various effects, and vice versa. In a way, I could actually argue that this notion of a direct causation as opposed is far more simple, right? I'm postulating less entities involved in the causation of my raising my arm or seeing red. The skeptics, as physicalists, are postulating multiple entities, physical intermediate mechanisms and intervening mechanisms that aren't necessary. I can explain that far simply by just saying my soul chose to raise my hand, boom, that produced the effects in my brain and body immediately and directly, and my hand goes up. So yeah, one could argue that actually substance dualism is far more simple, even assuming they're empirically equivalent. It's a simpler explanation compared to physicalism. So yeah, in light of the following critiques, I honestly think that the burden of proof is on the skeptic to prove that physicalism is better than substance dualism, which they fail at, and also they have to prove that substance dualism is more complex or complicated than physicalism. And yeah, the failure to do so on both accounts means that appealing to Occam's Razor is a total false argument. It's a failed argument on the part of skeptics. So yeah, those are the four main arguments. I've included things in it, but yeah, these are the four main reasons as to why skeptics will try to claim they can prove physicalism is true, but yeah, it's just unconvincing. Sorry, skeptics, but yeah, let's move into the second part of this show. So now we're going to look at the four main physicalist theories of the conscious substance, or the substance of consciousness, or the what is the nature of the conscious subject himself. It's on the second issue of Contention again, in the mind-body problem. So yeah, basically, as I said, there are four main physicalist theories. So this includes what's called animalism, material constitutionalism, which was recommended again by one of our listeners. So I got you back. I'm covering that. There's the brain view. So that's and also there's worm theory. So these are the four main physicalist theories for the substance of consciousness. And really, I think I'm going to refute all four of these as being utterly ridiculous, and they just show the sheer desperation of the skeptic when it comes to the problem of consciousness. This is really an issue for them that proves their worldview is not up to par with Christians or theists or subjective idealists who believe in some kind of non-physical substance or non-material substance. So yeah, let's get straight into that. So what's the first option? So this is what's called animalism. And animalism is really a minority physicalist view. Even other physicalists kind of berate this view. It's not a popular view among physicalists today. But yeah, what does it say? So it essentially says, look, we as humans, we as the conscious subject, are essentially a living organism that has an enduring life. So they would agree with my enduring life argument, but they would say enduring self argument, unlike David J. or unlike most physicalists that say we don't endure. But more accurately for them, here's the kicker. Here's why they're weirdos. They will say that, look, lives, it's the life that is essential to who you are. You are your life. You're not an organism that has life. That's what most scientists believe. That's what substance dualists believe. That's what common sense would say. No, they say, no. Lives are fundamental. Lives are primary. They have organisms. And by life, they define that as an event. It's a self-organizing, self-sustaining, totalizing event that encapsulates and enables an organism to sustain its internal structure despite material or physical alteration, right? You lose remember mereological essentialism in part 2 or part 3? A tree loses its leaf. Is it the same tree or not? And mainstream scientists and physicalists and substance dualists will say, well, if it's a physical object, no, it's a totally different tree because it's lost. It has new physical parts and or physical bonding relations. Therefore, it's not identical to the tree it was before. Animalists say no, we deny mereological essentialism. That's the same tree. Okay, well, what binds it then? It's a life. It's the totalizing event. So it's kind of like a mystical view. Instead of soul, they insert life as the enduring thing. So yeah, I think as you guys can kind of see, it's very weird. It's semi-mystical type view of this life type thing. So yeah, just remember that the life is seen as a special kind of event, described here by the sum total of the organism's metabolic activities over the entire time that sustains the internal structure of the organism that has that of the organism that comes attached or derives from that life. And just before I go into a critique of this, so I'm providing some sources on this, but some of the main proponents here are people like Eric Olson, Peter Van Inwagen, and Trenton Merricks. These are some of the people you should look up that hold to this weird animalism view. So yeah, what are some of the main objections? Let's get into this. There are really several here. I'm going to reduce it down to four for time's sake. So number one, as I said, it's weird. These guys think lives, an event, are ontologically basic or prior to the organism. The organism is only a derived entity from the living event itself. But this is backwards. I'm sorry, modern scientists, we all agree. Modern biology backs me up in refuting this nonsense. No, lives do not have organisms. I'm sorry, organisms have lives. Lives are not self-sustaining. Organisms are self-sustaining. And life is merely a set of activities or metabolic activities that occur within an organism. So in actuality, the organism is basic. Modern biology and biologists agree with me. Organisms have lives. This has been the majority view since the days of Aristotle, for crying out loud. It's just obvious. Okay, number two. This animalism view suffers from the too many thinkers problem. So basically, animalism tracks the biological features instead of psychological traits. So if we take the example of conjoined twins, imagine someone living in one body, but they have two heads. They have two separate streams of consciousness. I can both be hungry and tired at the same time with one head. But with the conjoined twins, this is actually not correct because one stream of consciousness is hungry and the other is tired in this hypothetical example. But the animalists can't recognize this basic fact because they're limited under animalism to studying only the biological traits rather than the psychological streams of consciousness. So they necessarily get the answer wrong. We all know that there are two separate streams of consciousness. There are two persons. One is hungry, one is tired. But animalists can't say that. They have to say, nope, there's only one guy and he's hungry and tired. And that's just wrong. So that's the problem of having too many thinking animals. So a third one is related to mereological essentialism versus the mereological aggregates. So remember that leaf example, lost by a living tree. Now, modern scientists, because of modern atomic theory, we understand physically what physical objects are. They're empty spaces, large empty spaces, and molecules, electrons, atoms, blah, 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 in a certain sort of bonding relationship. If that changes, they become a completely brand new. You take out one atom and put in a new one, you get an entirely new organism, or an entirely new physical object. Just like the raft, you take out one raft, you take out one wooden board and put in another. It's an entirely new raft. So modern atomic theory proves that the denial of mereological essentialism is false, and animalists have to deny mereological essentialism. Here's another way to look at it. Picture the brain as sort of like being a cloud under the notion of modern anatomy. So look, we can exchange a water molecule and then we'll have a new cloud. Just like I can exchange a molecule in my brain and we would be a totally new person. Animalists appeal to common sense and they'll say, well, no, but it's obviously one cloud. We're referring to the same one cloud up in the sky, and likewise I'm referring to the one brain. Just because you remove one little molecule doesn't mean you have an entirely brand new thing. But again, with the cloud example in the first place, we know that they are just mereological aggregates. It's an illusion that from a distance it looks like it's a cloud, but actually it's not. It's a mereological aggregate of water molecules in a certain sort of bonding relation, and that can change. And it's the exact same at a molecular level for the brain. Our brains are just clouds. as the same thing as a cloud. There isn't really it's a mereological aggregate of various molecules in certain bonding relations. So yeah, number 4, the last thing is animals have a difficult time distinguishing between a life and non-living things. Remember, lives are predominant for them. So look, hurricanes have lives. If you define the way animals define lives is an event, a series of activities that describes and defines that, the derived organism. So yeah, hurricanes have lives in the same sense a dog does under this animalist definition of what a life is. It's a self-maintaining, self-sustaining, and well-individuated continuant of the storm's activities, just like animals and humans have a self-sustaining, self-maintaining, well-individuated continuant of metabolic activities during their lives. So yeah, basically the difference between being alive physically and not being alive seems really to only be one of degree of activity. It's not, there's no substantive difference in kind. And yeah, animalists just have to arbitrarily or very ad hocly define what counts as life versus non-life based on knowledge that we know what is alive or not via a properly basic belief. And what's really going on here is we know what counts as life is they have a soul. That's what makes them alive. And animalists are borrowing and piggybacking upon that knowledge to make this definition. But if we don't assume the knowledge from the soul, under their definitions, they have no way of physically differentiating between life and non-living entities. So yeah, these are the 4 main problems against animalism. I think you can see it's total nonsense. Most physicalists believe it's total nonsense, but yeah, I'll provide some sources because this is not a common view, so you can check some of those out with Eric Olson or Peter Van Eenwagen and see what you guys think of it. But yeah, let's come to the second physicalist view, and this is what's called material constitutionalism. So this was recommended by one of the listeners. And this view is a little bit more respectable. It is growing in popularity over the past 15 to 20 years. It has adherents that include Christians, believe it or not. Some Christians are material constitutionalists. So yeah, just to give you an idea, some of the main adherents are people like Kevin Corcoran, and probably the most famous, the one I'll provide sources for, is Lynn Rudder Baker. So yeah, what is this physicalist view? What have the skeptics cooked up now to try and deny the obvious truth that we have a soul, or that consciousness is non-physical? Basically, in order to understand this view, we need to clarify the difference between a composition relation versus a constitution relationship. So the former is one that most lay people already know about. Look, it comprises many to one relationships. So for example, there are many atoms and molecules which compose my brain, or a single table, or a chair. That's the composition relationship. Now, a constitution relationship is more of a one-to-one relation between 2 different objects that are existing at the same place at the same time. Now, right away, you should be saying, what the heck is that weirdness? So here's an example that they'll use to illustrate the point. So imagine a chunk of marble. And that chunk of marble constitutes a statue of David. So there is both an object that is the statue of David and a chunk of marble coexisting in the same location at the same time. So this is what material constitutionists will say is a constituting relationship. And they say the same is true about human persons, about the conscious subject. Look, I am my brain, aka the chunk of marble, and my brain constitutes my consciousness, aka the statue of David. So basically, a person is defined as an entity that has the potentiality for a first-person perspective. So my brain constitutes a first-person perspective, is what they're saying, is what the view is. Now, it's crucial here. Understand, the constitution relationship is not the same as the identity relationship. There are two separate objects. There isn't one object that is described differently and they're identical to each other, as common sense would dictate and as what most people think, right? So, yeah, the best way to illustrate it is that the one I gave, the statue of David in Florence, is not identical to a lump of marble, to the lump of marble from which it's made. Because both objects, they'll try to say, well, both objects have different modal properties. And if something, right, the logical law of non-contradiction is true, if something is true of entity X and not true of entity Y, aka they have different properties, they cannot be identical. So they'll say, well, I could slice off David's nose or his head and change him up. He would no longer be a statue of David. He would have a different property. So yeah, the constitution relation, they're really unity relationships that stand somewhere between full-on identity relationships and having two independently existent objects having nothing to do with each other. So yeah, the constituting object or thing, the chunk of marble, is then said to be submerged or encompassed by the identity of what it constitutes, i.e. the statue of David. In our terminologies, the constituting entity, the brain, is submerged or encompassed by the identity of what it constitutes, namely consciousness. So this is the weirdness that is material constitutionalism. This is their view. So yeah, basically, they, like animalists, they deny mereological essentialism, and they do believe that there is an enduring self, unlike most physicalists today. However, where they differ with animalists, instead of it being a mystical notion of life, a life event that is enduring and continues, instead the human organism, instead what material constitutionalists say endures is the constituted person, the constituted first-person perspective is what endures for the life of the organism until he dies or that sort of thing. So, yeah, that's the difference there. So let's get into refuting this nonsense. Sorry. Yeah, so number one, look, this view fails to account for the positive evidences I gave in part 3, as do all physicalist notions. But secondly, look, this is completely an ad hoc and strained explanation. To suppose that there are two different objects that can be co-located and submerged into this constitution relationship is just nonsense. I mean, Baker will claim, look, the logical law of non-contradiction isn't being violated because there are different kinds of objects. The marble is the constituting object, aka the brain, and the statue, or the first-person perspective, aka the person, is the constituted object. But this is just a distinction without a difference. This is just a made-up nonsense, and it's pure question begging. We have plenty of different kinds of objects, and none of them stand in this what's called a constitutive relationship. Lions and tigers, proton and electrons, none of them can even possibly exist in this co-located manner. It violates the logical law of non-contradiction. And it's the same deal here with the brain versus the first-person perspective. So yeah, it's inconceivable that two objects in exactly the same place and time, and that are completely physically indistinguishable from each other, same mass, size, shape, etc., blah blah blah, but yet they also are claimed to have different properties. No, this is logically impossible and absurd. There is no such thing as this constitution relation. It's complete nonsense. There is identity relations, there are cause and effect relationships, there are correlation relations, there are composition relations. The constitution relation is complete made-up nonsense, and modern scientists all agree with me about this. I'm sorry, there's only one object there. There's a lump of marble in the shape of King David. There aren't two different objects there. Also, defining a person as the property of being in the first person perspective is illogical and makes no sense. Look, substances have properties. That's what the word substance means. They stand under and bear up their properties. It makes no sense to say that, oh, well, actually, a substance is a property, the property of being in the first person perspective. That's just nonsense. So, yeah, basically, the first person view, being in the first person point of view of Dale, is actually just a way of describing an ontologically prior substantial person. I exist as a substance and bear the property of being in the first person perspective of Dale. Finally, another skeptic, another expert, Dean Zimmerman, and see the sources, I provided an article by him, argues rather conclusively that this view is just totally illogical because physicalism demands that an object can't lose all of its physical parts and still be the same thing. He goes on, so this is him defending mereological essentialism. Look, there are inherent limits on how later stages of an object can be thought to evolve from earlier stages. But Lynn Rudder Baker's notion just ignores all of those limitations that we know from our experience and from science and all of that altogether. So, yeah, she just fails here. The only way you can get around this is by positing a soul that can sustain the property of personhood through the loss of all the parts, the physical parts. Constitutionalism just doesn't work, as does animalism. I think there'll be plenty of sources. I mean, as I said, there are dozens of arguments against this view and how foolish it is. So look those up. But I think I've kind of refuted it here. So let's go into the third physicalist view. Now this, by far, is the most popular view. This is the brain view. This is the view that Darren believes in. This is the view that David Johnson believes in. Although David Johnson has a interesting qualifier where he's like, well, specific part of the brain, you are your badly cloned memory engrams. But yeah, this position is fairly straightforward. It's by far the vast majority view among scientists and neuroscientists and that sort of thing. They just say, look, the conscious subject is identical to their physical brain, or more accurately, to certain specific parts of the brain and the nervous system. So this nuance or qualification basically recognizes that, look, not all the parts of the brain have a direct connection to consciousness. I can remove certain tissues or blood in the brain has nothing to do with consciousness in a direct way. But at the same time, there are certain non-brain parts that do have a direct connection to consciousness, such as the central nervous system or my optic nerves or pain receptors or something like that. So yeah, this position must assume, in order to work, this position has to assume two non-proven assumptions, and you'll see skeptics mindlessly just assuming this is the case. Otherwise, the brain view just totally fails. So the first is what's called the TSM principle. So this is the thinking subject maximalism principle, which states that a conscious subject or thinker's parts are all and only those involved directly in consciousness. Okay, great. Well, that's what I said above. But number two, there's also the PIP principle, PIP. So that stands for the psychological individuation principle. And this states that all conscious states belong to the same conscious subject only if they causally interact with each other. So the reason they go for this principle is they have to assume this is because this is what allows for the unification of varying conscious selves or states in order to be considered a person, a single entity, a single conscious subject. So these are just their unproven assumptions. Let's look at this and kind of refute this nonsense that these skeptics have come up with, that we are identical to our brains and or certain parts of our brain and central nervous system, etc. So the first objection one could raise right away against this is really to challenge these non-evidenced assumptions on the part of physicalist skeptics. The TSM principle, for example, requires something to be directly involved with consciousness. But what does that mean? That's a very vague definition. And more likely, in fairness, to be fair, what neuroscientists have in mind here is probably, look, the physical parts in question can be proven to directly cause a given conscious state or property. Remember the difference between causation relations and identity relations. So what neuroscientists do is they'll depict brain states as subvenient causes for emergent supervenient mental effects or conscious states and properties. But think of what that means, though. Emergent supervenience presupposes a causal relationship. It's like how the combination of molecules of H2O, the subvenient molecules, cause the emergent supervenient property of wetness to obtain. This is an example I think Darren gave in one of his write-ups. I put his sources in part 2 there. But remember, establishing cause and effect relationships logically prove that they're not identical. They rule out the identity relationships. You can't have one without the other. You can't have one and the other. It's an either or. Either they stand in cause and effect relationships, or they stand in identity relationships. And since neuroscientists have proven that they stand, that emergent conscious properties are supervenient on various subvenient brain states and that sort of thing, then we know that brain states cause conscious states. They're not identical to consciousness. So yeah, boom. This violates, according to the logical law of identity, if something's true of one and not the other, they're not identical. It's like when fire causes smoke. The smoke, the effect, is not identical to the fire, its cause. They have different properties, and such as the smoke coming into existence at time 2 versus the prior fire, the cause, existing at time 1. The fire cannot be identical to the smoke because the fire causes the smoke to come into being. Boom, you're destroyed, skeptics. But what about PIP? What about the PIP principle? This unifying principle? Well, in the first place, it's not true. One can have a thought that has no causal relationships whatsoever to my other thoughts or thinking or that sort of thing. If I think of a logical premise, a logical deductive argument or syllogism, the prior premises, my thinking about the prior premises do not cause my thought of the conclusion. Rather, it's a free conclusion one draws based on a direct insight of understanding the premises and their logical relations. So you can't even prove this PIP assumption. This psychological unifying or individuation principle is absolutely false, provably so. Here's another objection. The brain view can't account for certain indexical facts. So that's like using the word I, first person facts. I am identical to my brain. For example, there are no exhaustive third person descriptions of all brains in the entire universe that can answer the question, I am identical to my brain, to a brain, sorry, but which brain am I identical to? See, the only way you can possibly answer that is to presuppose a first-person perspective, a conscious substance, a subject, a non-physical soul, or else there's no answer to this question. Skeptics using scientific third-party descriptions can never answer this question. It's impossible to answer. Oh, not so fast, though, Dale, because skeptics have tried to be smart in coming up with an answer, and they'll try to say this. Let's say this. Through a sleight of hand, I can say, well, when I say I and my brain, or my brain, I'm saying, look, I'm identical to my brain. Boom, this solves the problem, right? Wrong, skeptics. Sorry, because when you use the word my brain, my is either a possessive adjective or a possessive noun. And in either case, this my is derivative of the first person indexical I. You're just saying, I have this particular brain. That's all you're saying. And again, this cannot be captured scientifically. This is a proposition or fact that is true and cannot be explained scientifically or answered using third-party scientific facts. Okay, number 3. Again, there's the too many thinkers problem. So remembering that cloud example and the mereological essentialism I mentioned before. But there's a specific issue in the brain view here, because brain view proponents will not deny mereological essentialism. They'll simply deny that there's an enduring self or something like that. But basically, okay, if that's the case, then this position holds that there are various subsystems in the brain. And these are isolated. There's no connection between them in terms of the conscious states they produce at a given time. There's no interaction. So it's kind of like, do you remember the example I gave of the 5 cooks with parts of the recipe? They're all conscious of it at the same time, synchronized, but they don't have phones to connect. They're isolated. None of them could know the entire recipe and have a unified knowledge of the recipe or unified field, a totalizing state of consciousness. But yet we do. Therefore, we cannot be our brains, because we have part of our totalizing state of consciousness, or this unified field, involves subsystems in the brain that are isolated and cannot interact with each other at any given time, at this given time. Therefore, we cannot be our brain. We cannot be identical. This totalizing state that I experience is not explainable via the physical components of the brain or relations of the brain. Finally, the last argument here is brains are divisible. They're separable objects, as physical objects always are. So yeah, it makes sense to speak of brains in terms of percentages. And it's the exact same deal in terms of brain functioning as well. If you want to say, well, we're brain functioning, not the brain itself. But unfortunately, persons are all or nothing. We know this to be the truth. I am a full person. It doesn't make any sense to describe me as being 53% Dale today. But that doesn't apply to physical objects like the brain. I can remove half the brain. This results in my removing a certain amount of brain functioning as well. But yet I, as a complete 100% Dale Glover person, still exists there. But this shouldn't be the case with the brain view. So, boom, you're refuted, skeptics. All right, lastly, here's the final view. Okay, we're over an hour already, so let me do this quickly. There is the 4-dimensional worm theory view. And to understand this, we need to understand the different notions of time. So there is the ontological status of time. There are theories about persistence through time, or in time, or whatever. And then there's an A theory versus B theory of time. So there are on the ontological status of time, there are 2 notions. There's presentism. Basically, there is a past, present, and future. We are in the present. There is a actual present that exists. And then there's 4-dimensionalism, which this view holds to. So this says presentism is false. The most popular version of 4-dimensionalism is eternalism, and that's what 4-dimensional worm theory advocates for. But it says everything, the past, present, and future all exists tenselessly all at once. So if you picture it this way, as like with the A theory or B theory as well, there's temporal becoming. A theory believes that there is temporal becoming. The past doesn't exist right now. The future doesn't exist, but it will come into existence. There's only the present. So if you picture a ruler as the timeline, past, present, and future, the present is the 5 centimeter mark. The only thing that exists under an A theory of time is the 5 centimeter dash. The rest of the ruler doesn't exist, ontologically speaking. Under a B theory of time, or this four-dimensional understanding, no, the entire ruler exists. Past, present, and future all exist at the same time, but they stand in illusory relations of earlier than and later than. But the 4 centimeter mark exists at the same time as the 5 centimeter, and same deal with the 20 centimeter mark. The entire ruler exists. Now there is another part here about theories about persistence. So the enduring self. So substance dualists Christians will typically go for the endurance. I shouldn't say that. I go for the endurance view. So I think that things last over time by being wholly present at each moment that they exist in. So things don't have temporal parts. They exist fully and wholly in the present. At the 5 centimeter mark, I, Dale, the person Dale, the subconscious substance Dale is fully here, and in the when the 6 centimeter, the future comes about, I will be fully present as a person at that moment, as a conscious subject. Perdurance, on the other hand, which is what the worm theory people believe in, rather ridiculously, they say substances or things last over time by having parts. So they see us persons, or the conscious subject, as a four-dimensional worm extended through time, extended throughout that entire ruler. So people have temporal phases. You are not a full person at the 5 centimeter mark. You're not a full person at the 20 centimeter mark. You are not a full person at the 4 centimeter mark. You are a full person over the course of the person is the entire ruler throughout time. But at the 5 centimeter, you are only part of the person Dale. I am a temporal phase, so to speak. So another way of picturing this, that Brian Greene, a skeptical atheist, astrophysicist and that sort of thing, who wrote an excellent book, he uses, let's think of a loaf of bread. So I as a person, the conscious subject is the loaf of bread. But there are various slices that are temporal phases of that person. They are parts of the whole person extended through time. So yeah, basically this view does have a couple advantages, but the main one is it solves the problem of the material constitutionalists, because it says that there is only one object that exists, but it exists at different modes at different temporal phases. So there's the lump of marble in the shape of David for some time phase, but in others it's in its headless temporal phase, or it's a lump of marble without any shape temporal phase before it was carved into the statue of David. So they're more like substance dualists in this regard. They deny this nonsensical notion of a constitution relation or co-location. But as we'll see, they still suffer from the multiple thinkers problem, that cloud, because with them there could be multiple worms that come about, just like there are multiple clouds. If you replace a molecule and that sort of thing, okay, well, if I replace a temporal event in my series of life, then you could have multiple temporal worms, four-dimensional person worms that are overlapping, and this is just ridiculous to envision. Okay, so let's refute this worm theory quickly. So in the first place, there are strong reasons and arguments and evidence to prove that the B theory of time is false, that four-dimensionalism is false, that perdurance is nonsensically and laughably false. It denies our properly basic beliefs of what we all know to be true. It denies the use of temporal indexicals, like using I am here now, or back then I did this. It denies the obvious fact I'm a complete person right now, this second. I am a whole substance. I'm not part of a temporal worm substance. I'm not a temporal phase of a person. I'm not a slice of bread. That's just ridiculous. But yeah, skeptics will just once again come back on this with their old trick. It's an illusion. It's not real. You think it's real, but it's not. And this just annoys me. This is just nonsense on the part of skeptics. It really feels. I don't want to come across as though I'm just bashing skeptics, but I think I want to say this. You need to understand that it really looks like you deny all of that we have free will when I know that we do have it. You deny our common sense notions that we all know I exist in the present here and now, as opposed to as a temporal phase. You and everything goes back to, oh, it's an illusion. You deny that I'm an enduring self. I'm the same person I was yesterday as I was 8 years ago, and that sort of thing. It just seems like you can't handle the truth and want to deny it, and at any cost, even denying what you yourself know to be true, in the hopes that, well, someday science will show that I'm right. That's how it comes across. I don't want to necessarily say, well, that is what you're doing, but that is how it looks to me from my end. So yeah, let's move on. So another one is Richard Swinburne's the fission operation, the split brain experiment, thought experiment. So let's say half my brain is put into an identical clone body, and the other half is put into another clone duplicate. Worm theory skeptics cannot answer the problem of, okay, where am I? Which temporal worm is now me? Is it the badly clone? Is it the clone number 1 with the left half of my brain, or is it clone number 2 with the right half of my brain? And because each 4-dimensional worm here, each clone person worm, is psychologically indistinguishable from each other, this is a real dilemma for these people, because it constitutes what's called the closest continuer problem in philosophy. So basically, identity relations are established based only on the two entities involved, being compared and being claimed to be identical. But with worm theory, and with this experiment, actually both clones, half my brain, are now just as close as a continuer of the person stages or temporal phases of me as a 4-dimensional worm as each other. Quote unquote, I at any given time is nothing more than a time phase rather than a full person. Worm theorists can never, in principle, it's logically impossible for them to ever know which worm clone they are identical to after this hypothetical fission operation. That's a real problem for you skeptics. Thank God I've got a soul, and I'm a substance dualist, so I don't get into these logical conundrums that you guys do, that physicalists do, that hold to this worm theory. Finally, worm theorists also claim that one's past history is essential or identical to who they are as persons. So think of how ridiculous this is. This means that all the past events that happened to me, I just happened to choose to wear a red shirt today as opposed to a blue shirt. That happened necessarily. That is essential to who I am, according to the worm theorists. But this is logically absurd. I could easily have worn a blue shirt instead of a red shirt, for example. So, yeah, I'm sorry. My history is an accidental feature that I, as a person, have in the here and now. It is not an essential feature or thing that I, as a conscious subject, am, right? It's not part of my personhood that I chose to wear a red shirt as opposed to a blue shirt today. This is just complete rubbish, and yeah, it's not true at all. Okay, so that'll be it. Thank goodness. I know that's a bit long. That'll be it for my series, my lecture series. I've been sort of provocative with the skeptics and the physicalists in this series. I hope it doesn't come across offensively, but I think I need to put a strong or firm stance on how powerful the evidences are against physicalism when it comes to consciousness. Otherwise, there tends to be an assumption, a dismissal of everything that I'm saying. So I do apologize if it's come across as being offensive when I say things are obvious, or I say the skeptics are totally absurd or rubbish or that sort of thing. Just understand, I've done so with a purpose, because I really need to feel that I need to shake you up and take these things seriously and give it a rethink. Don't just go with the flow and dismiss what I'm saying. Really think about these things, because it is really clear that physicalism, in terms of the consciousness issue, is false. That is what I honestly believe. And that's why I've tried to be a bit more firm or provocative in the way I present the show. But yeah, hopefully you guys look past that, forget about the rhetoric, and look at the substance of what I'm saying. What do you make of the actual substantive arguments that I make? Think about those and check out some of the sources that I make, and do a little bit of research to see if what I'm saying makes sense to you or not. That's what I hope to spur you guys on to do here as skeptics, and hopefully for people that are already agree with me, hopefully I'll provide you with some reasons to strengthen your confidence that you are not just your brain, you are not a lump of physical matter. You as a conscious subject are a non-physical substance. And you have non-physical conscious properties and states. If I've given you pause for thought or done that, then I will be happy and achieve my purpose. So look out for part 5 once Andrew's prepared, and we'll have a good discussion or debate on these things. So all right, everyone, have a great day. Bye-bye.